Welcome to the Busy Fit Podcast, episode 41. We've officially are on our trek to 50 podcasts, which is exciting. Today is going to be you know what? I'm going to let Aaron explain the subject because he's the guy. We're going to let him talk about it. Go for it.
I'm not the guy, I'm a guy. Speaking of guys, one thing we want to talk about, and I think one thing that we both kind of get asked a good bit about is training differences between genders. So, should men train differently than women? Are there more or less consideration that women may have to, how their workout should be tailored to make up for, differences in hormones or menstrual cycles and a lot of other things. And I think that, like anything in the fitness and health industry, it's a topic that some people may be a little bit more on one end of the spectrum of everything has to be different. Like, are you kidding? You have men and women train the same? That's insane because there's so many, there's all these differences with their bodies or hormones. And then you have the other side of the spectrum that's like, no, we're all humans, like regardless of gender, age, whatever. And it's like, okay, well, maybe there needs to be that happy medium where, we put in the more relevant considerations and just kind of highlight those things. So I think that's what we're going to kind of talk about here today is just gender specific training and what that is, or, what it could be and maybe what it shouldn't be too, just to make sure that we are kind of staying on that fine middle ground of that spectrum. So
I think it's a fun subject to talk about. And I actually have a little bit of anecdotal experience with this. So for those that don't know, I was a head coach of a Division II program at 23 years old. And so obviously I had no idea kind of what I was doing at that point. But we had a volunteer coach who was an astrophysicist. He was nerd. He was absolutely adamant that women cannot train in the same timing, intervals, lifting weights will ruin all swimmers that are female. He was so far on that side that when I was the assistant coach the year prior, he convinced the head coach to basically just run a dry land where they just rode for 2 hours instead of going into the weight room. It was just a bunch of random stuff and didn't work out well. But
so you get for being a nerd.
Yeah. So that was my little experience with that. And I strongly disagreed. And, obviously there's a time and place for things to be different and time and place for things to be the same, which I'm excited for us to kind of dive into today. But not sure it has to be that strict rule of this is 100% the right answer all the time. So excited to dive into it. And, and I guess let's just get right to it. I'm curious, what do you think? Before we dive into specifics, should men and women train the same?
Yeah, well, I don't want to give the answer too early here, but I think we can because like a lot of things that we talk about, it isn't just so binary. It's not like a yes or no. They should or should not. They're men lie on a spectrum of their physiological ability. Women lie on the same spectrum. And I think ultimately some women need more of a certain type of training. Some men may need more of a certain type of training. And that's in context of peak performance. And I don't want to stay too hard on the example of we both worked with, high level swim programs in the past and the differences there. And, there are some considerations that we'll have with populations like that. But ultimately, it's really going to be context dependent on the person, their ability, their training age and history. But if I had to be binary and say one or the other, men and women should or should not train the same, I guess I would lean more towards they should train the same. But I do think it's very important that we talk about some of the considerations we'll kind of run into. Because, there's myths or in some historical context that I think lies around this belief of your neuroastrophysicist, scientist, surgeon, helper that oh, well, women shouldn't lift heavy, or if guys just look at a barbell, they're going to get stronger and gain muscle. And, there's also these more societal stereotypes around women just need to go in and, do this type of training and all men want to do and should do is go in and max out every day in the weight room. Neither of those is the case. And I think we need to first kind of stray away from stereotypes and those myths and first understand like, okay, well, first, what are the differences between men and women that we need to keep in consideration when we're talking about training? Most of it's pretty obvious as far as like what those main gender differences are going to be. I've already mentioned a couple of them, but from an endocrine hormonal standpoint, like guys are riddled with testosterone, most of them. And, there's other, even human growth hormone or IGF or these different, like, more anabolic, naturally occurring proteins in our bodies that, like, we have that men have that women may not have as much of that are going to maybe influence that societal stereotype of like, oh, men need to lift heavy and get big. So those endocrine, those hormonal changes, with that comes a lot of fiber composition differences. I'm not going to say men are way more type 2 dominant than women because there are many women. We've both trained a couple of them that are like twitchier and stronger than a lot of men too. I can think of one athlete I train right now that lifts a lot more than the guys at an even lighter body weight and out jumps most of them too on our weekly jumps as well. So like there's gonna be those differences, right? But hormone differences, muscle or soft tissue composition differences. So like the ratio of different types of muscle in the body, I think are the two big ones. And another part of, I guess, kind of both of that is with the hormonal difference and how that affects the body's composition. Like, women, generally speaking, like need more fat than men to operate and to live healthily. So, that's going to play another factor as well. And kind of going off on a little bit of a tangent there, but I think to try to wrap it up, like the main differences we need to consider are going to be those hormonal and those composition type differences. Or anything else that you would maybe add to that?
Well, I think the hormonal side for females obviously is very important. And again, we're talking about like if we need to get really specific on the spectrum with we're talking with an elite athlete, that's going to be, there are the females that are significantly more type 2 and going to need, to train very differently than, that. But you have the same considerations in a male and female population. Like we've looked at distance swimmers and distance runners, and they have a very different breakdown than a all-out sprinter or a power lifter or someone that's doing a lot of those like shorter burst things. And so those considerations exist on males, then they exist with females. So it's like if you take it and you say, okay, well, this female trains more like a male, for example, well, you're just saying that that female trains more like this male. But like you just said, there's those females that are significantly stronger than some of the guys. Well, that guy is just on a different spot on that spectrum for what a male is. Now, the big thing from the hormonal aspect is, and something that I was not incredibly in tune with when I coached college because it just wasn't discussed regularly because we're so periodized driven in a sense of like we have to peak at this time. This is when we have to perform our best. But for the general population, training around the menstrual cycle and training at the right phases actually makes a really big difference, both in the results you get and how they feel and their long-term ability to get results. So that's the biggest difference. And I don't know if you've noticed that kind of bleed over into the competitive side at all, or if that's purely something that's kind of just more general health.
Yeah, not to get off on too much of a tangent with training around the menstrual cycle.
Yeah.
And shameless plug on our end, we do have a guide or two out that kind of goes over maybe more training specifics around the menstrual cycle for females. But I think that it's definitely a topic that a lot of people want to do a really good job with of like tailoring training around menstrual cycles, particularly in like maybe your lower like number roster female teams, like a women's basketball or something, where it's like more manageable to try to orient programming around that. But even then, even if you are doing a really good job at it, I don't think that the differences that you would see from like the first iteration that's not taking that into consideration versus the second iteration of taking the menstrual cycle in consideration is going to be too much different because in an athletic population, at least, because ultimately, like we're training to, like you said, peak at the right time to compete at this moment and be the most ready at this moment. Unfortunately, that doesn't always line up with where some females may be at with their menstrual cycle. 9 times out of 10, we have to train according to that and peaking at the right time. But I think there's a fine balance of doing both. But again, we have a guide out there somewhere in the interwebs that go over those specifics and maybe just some more general considerations to think about for the general population of when you are going through different phases of your menstrual cycle, and when more volume may be more appropriate, when higher intensity would be appropriate, or when just more general rest would be appropriate as well. It's kind of on that subject, something you did spark in my mind there. If we are talking in context of like the peak performance. Another thing, we talked about like the hormone differences, the body composition differences. Another thing is, I guess, related to the body composition, but just joint structure differences as well, particularly maybe for more like field-based sports like soccer or lacrosse or something. Not really a high consideration for a general population in terms of like, oh, this person has a much bigger Q angle and we need to focus more on this or that, or even like certain limb lengths that may not be as gender specific. Like you'll have your long femur women and long femur men or something men. But again, just another categorical piece to maybe consider if you do want to really dive deep in the weeds of like gender specific training. But again, ultimately, I'd probably leave that to the higher end professionals that their whole job is to split as many hairs as possible and write the most perfect program they can. So for us, for you and I, maybe not so much. But I do like the point that you made to kind of go back. If you have this woman and this man, and this woman is actually stronger than this man because of the way she trains and everything, there's always going to be that crossover of those two different spectrums. I think that what we're kind of talking about here is just the understanding of those genetic predispositions to what pulls those different spectrums apart. I mean, there's a few female weightlifters that I follow that weigh 60 kilos and can out clean and jerk me. Stuff like that's just insane. Whereas, some men, distance runner or something, like, oh, they can't lift any weight at all. So the training, and I think we're kind of talking more about the weight room training side, can be different, and the adaptations of that training can be different. But ultimately, I would like, there's going to be those again, like, that we're going to be predisposed to maybe higher testosterone levels or certain muscle fiber type ratio, but understanding where we're at on that, and then ultimately just training to like what our actual goals are, like that should be the specific training. I think, not to get a little ahead of ourselves, but being goal oriented rather than like gender oriented, I think is a bigger key. But again, some things that we've talked about that I think are still relevant to know and talk about and understand as well.
Absolutely. I think so. For the context, to make it simple for us not to always have to come back to, that female that's on one side of the spectrum, the male that's on one side of the spectrum, we'll just kind of frame it up as we're talking about the average of what typically is normal for that genetic disposition versus us having to frame up that context every single time for every subject. So we'll just assume it's the average male, average female. Is that a probably good kind of place for us to move forward at?
Yeah, no doubt. Well, Justin, we've talked about the differences, but now let's talk about maybe where some things that could or should remain the same when we're talking about training, men versus women. So what are some areas in your mind where training should be similar, whether that's like, the exercise type, the amount of relative volume or relative intensity? What are some things that could or should be similar?
Well, some things that should definitely be similar is if you're training for a specific task. I think the training has to be the normal breakdown of what training for that task would be. And again, we use the reference of swimmers a lot because we obviously have spent a lot of time working with swimmers. But if we're training someone to be a strong butterflyer, like we're probably going to train and protect their joints in their posture around being a strong butterflyer. But, if you're talking even for general population, you think about like someone that's just able to do activities of daily living and do them well and be mobile. those are going to be some pretty similar things you're going to have people do. And so from a exercise selection perspective, I do think that there is a general area where like things should stay pretty similar from a selection perspective. Now, there are caveats to that. If someone's either pregnant or postpartum, like there's going to be a ton of stuff around pelvic floor. Someone's doing, more lateral movements, and you may or may not feel the same about this, but for a female, like we're going to do a lot of work to protect their knees just because of being so prone to any ACL tear or anything along those lines. But from a just general, you think about the needs of whatever they want to accomplish, those exercise selections should stay fairly similar because they're trying to accomplish the same task. If we ask a female to climb up Mount Everest and we ask a male to climb up Mount Everest, we're probably going to want to be protecting most of the same things and building resiliency around joints the exact same way, or building a similar strength. And you may not necessarily get the same result. Like women, I think you hear a big thing like trying to, they don't want to get bulky or they don't want to get strong. But in reality, like we talked about before, men are going to have a genetic disposition to have significantly more testosterone. So you don't necessarily have to worry as much about like that being a concern. And so from a weightlifting perspective, like I think it can be fairly similar. What do you think?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head as far as like the things that should be similar is being task oriented ultimately, or, goal oriented. What are we actually training for? To be a little bit more specific though, too, and I also agree with you, is like general movement and exercise selection, I think can be shared, 99% the same between men and women. Like you said, there may be those subtle differences where like, oh, women can focus on this a little bit more, or men may tolerate this type of movement a little bit more. But, generally speaking, everyone can benefit from good compound movements. Everyone can benefit, whether it's from, a weight loss perspective, a general strength perspective, a bone structure and density perspective, like doing some sort of heavier resistance training with intolerance to like just get a little bit stronger. I think that it doesn't matter where you lie on either spectrum, because a lot of that is going to still be relative. So like if you have a really well-trained male versus an untrained female, I'm not going to ask both of them to go squat 405, but I am going to go ask both of them to squat. And, what that intensity may look like and what that progression or regression of a squat, whether it's a back squat or goblet squat or even a bodyweight squat hold, is going to be very different. But that's not because it's gender specific. It's because of where they're at, So yeah, I think ultimately we're talking about where training needs to be similar. It needs to be similar in the sense that it is that goal or task oriented. If we are playing a sport or want to play a sport or like have a certain goal in mind of building muscle, losing fat, whatever. And then again, like the strategies and exercises of how we do that, as far as like the movements themselves, 99% can be similar as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you see too many people getting a little bit too in the weeds with that. And I think you do see a lot of marketing around, targeting a specific group of women or a specific group of men, saying these exercise programs aren't built for you necessarily. But I think that's honestly a lot of really good marketing, but not necessarily a ton of truth to it. I would caution people to see someone being in a specific wheelhouse. Say, for example, they're talking about just catering towards postpartum women in their 40s, for example. And it's like, it's great to target that, but that's like a specific wheelhouse saying like, this is the only person that I know how to work with. But you go into that population, and even within that, there's so many variances. And so it's kind of important to not have a wheelhouse and be able to like address just what's right for that person. Because you say postpartum woman in their 40s, well, Dara Torres was postpartum in her 40s and ended up being an Olympic gold medal. But you take that and you take the person that's like never exercised. You can't say those two people are the same in any way. So there can be big variances within that population. It's just important that it's, like you say, goal and task oriented.
Yeah, and also, and to an extent, like if you look at the training of like what a postpartum women in their 40s expert, like what they're giving to that target audience or population, there's probably a lot more similarities than differences in terms of like what that quote unquote specialty in training would look like anyways. So let's pivot though and talk about maybe like even with that, like if there are a lot of similarities, there might be some differences though, or considerations that could be different for men versus women. And again, not to beat the dead horse on swimming, but I know this is a heavy and not a heavy topic, but a topic in swimming in terms of how we train men and women differently. So curious to hear your thoughts on, we know where areas should be similar in training with exercise selection and being goal oriented, but where should they be different, or where can they be different if we did want to kind of get in the weeds on that?
It's an interesting subject. It's developed a lot over the last 15 years or so. I think if you were to look back in the early 2000s, you would see that primarily women, it was almost all aerobic based training was what they focused on. And you definitely have the people that are on the side of like, yeah, that's all it ever needs to be. And that's all it should be focused on. But then you have people that are training females almost like males from a sprint perspective, where it's like it's truly goal and task oriented. Now, generally, if you're talking about that average male and average female we talked about, and that average female is typically going to have like less fast twitch fibers than a male, they will have I guess, a predisposition to be better at that aerobic style training and excel in that area. And so that is something that I think people or females do benefit from, is having that aerobic training, being even part of a general health program more than generally males can. And I think that's what we see typically with our population now is, we have a lot of guys that can go out and lift 3 to 4 times a week and just get some walking in, and they're going to be super fit. And women, some can do that, and we definitely have some that do that, but there's also the women where they may lift 3 times a week and they may do a little bit of cardio 1 or 2 times a week, and that's going to fit them a little bit better. So I think there is that like little bit of lean towards doing a little bit more aerobic. And that's honestly the biggest difference I think I notice, is just in terms of that spectrum. Like, are we training fully, weight training, or are we adding in some aerobic components as well? That's at least what I think, kind of from a volume and intensity standpoint. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's usually where the argument kind of boils down to, is the volume, intensity, or even frequency for some people. I think there's this, I want to call it a historical myth, but I think I guess the historical point of view is that women can tolerate higher volumes of training, maybe relative to men. And I should have need to be more well versed on this. And I think we talk a little bit about it in our, menstrual cycle training considerations guide. With estrogen, that it has some anti-inflammatory effects. Whether that is something that plays a role in that, like, theoretical capacity to handle higher volume, that may be the case, or if it is just because, women have that base biological need for a higher body fat percentage relative to men, that, there is more body fat stored, that they can accomplish more aerobic activity. Again, I think a little bit of speculation there, but I don't think it's a myth per se. Another thing that I thought was interesting working with track and field is we would have like our faster sprinters, our more twitchy events, jumpers as well, the women train at certain times of the day, typically in the morning, because some research has shown that that's when, women's testosterone may be a little higher. So, we talk about volume and intensity, but even like the time of day could be another consideration as well. And again, I think that we're talking about like elite level sprinters, and that's going back to the professionals or coaches that really want to split as many hairs as possible and get as much of training as possible and squeeze as much juice as they can. But yeah, I think ultimately, like, women may be able to tolerate those higher volumes. Not to say that they can't handle higher intensities at all, because again, I train women that handle high intensity way better than me. And whether that's because, they're in their 20s and I'm in my 30s, who knows? But again, I think that Where it does turn, I guess, more problematic is when you say more adamantly, oh, women shouldn't lift heavy because they don't tolerate that higher intensity or they can't recover from that as well, or they don't have, the hormones or body composition to be able to tolerate that because like that's just not true. So yeah, a little bit of a tangent there.
So, yeah, I think overall, it's just really important to recognize that, there are a lot of similarities, there are some differences, but ultimately it comes down to training and nutrition and everything being correct for that individual versus it being correct for a general population. Because you can say all we want that things are based on, this is what's right for females, this is what's right for males, but that doesn't factor in that specific individual. So it's really important that you do a full needs analysis of what's right for each person to make sure they're getting exactly what they need to be the best that they can be, regardless of whether they're competing in sport, whether they're competing in just trying to be like happy and healthy. And even then, like we're talking about optimal training, but optimal training also may not even be sustainable. So it's making sure it's like, all right, this is the best training given this person. For someone that, if you're talking about a college athlete or someone that's training for peak performance, like their window for peak performance may be only a couple years, but so it's like, all right, they can train at a higher capacity during that time. But when they are talking about, okay, I just want to be happy and healthy for the next 30 years, they're not going to do the same things they did during that first 1 and 3 years that they were peaking. So it's just making sure it's the right training for whatever individual at that specific given time.
Yeah, no doubt. I don't know if I've said this analogy on here before or not, but like the Honda Civic versus the top fuel dragster.
No.
The way you're looking at me, I'm going to go with no. So, if you take a Honda Civic and you invest $20,000 worth of time, personnel, resources, like you're going to get a completely different car. It's going to be this like new badass race car, right? If you take a top fuel dragster like the quarter mile big boys and you invest that same $20,000 of time, personnel, resources, you may at that point only be getting a few more horsepower, right? But at that level of competition, like it's that few extra horsepower that matter. But the general population is not top fuel dragsters. Like we don't really need to be worrying about those 3 horsepower or like being as specific as like male versus female training to get, I'm going to change my volume just this little bit because I'm a male. Worry about the other things that have so much more juice to squeeze when it comes to like your training, your nutrition, your lifestyle, because I think that's what's ultimately going to make a bigger difference and, make you as the metaphorical race car bigger and better too. I think we can close off. I'm going to ask this question off the cuff here because with saying all of that, like, gender differences for training considerations may not be the most important thing when we're talking about like, oh, we have a new athlete coming to work with us. If you could identify 3, and I will limit it there, and this is going to be tough for both of us, but 3 maybe more important considerations for a general population person that's coming to us asking for training. What are 3 maybe more important considerations that we should make for them? I'll start off with my first one, and maybe that'll kind of get the wheels turning here. First big one for me is going to be injury history. That's not like a sexy answer, but I know for me, always the first thing I'm going to jump out at because a lot of what, like, if we're writing a program is going to be tailored around the aches and pains and what we want to, get moving more good. So injury history is going to be the first one for me, but I'll make you take it from there.
You always have to throw 1 or 2 out off the cuff that make me just like think way too quickly. I always want to go like my first thing is like, what's the goal? And so I don't know if that can count.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good answer. Why not?
Yeah, because if you don't know what you're working towards, then it's really hard to get there. I think going into that, you can dive into, obviously you can go into injury and all of that stuff. I think that all kind of just like encompasses it, because if your goal is to run a marathon or your goal is just to, look better on the beach or whatever it is, like if it's just look better on the beach, you're not someone that's ever going to play a sport. Like I just need to make sure your knee that, blew out 20 years ago doesn't blow out again. It doesn't have to
Sure.
be crazy resilient. It's just got to not get injured again. Versus the person that's going to say, okay, I want to go and I want to play soccer and I tore my ACL 20 years ago. Like that person be like, we need to bulletproof your knee. Like we need to do everything we can to make sure it's supported properly. But yeah, I think goals is a good place to start.
That's a good answer. It could bite us in the butt because it's a very broad answer, so it may pigeonhole us a little bit on the other answer. So I'm going to fire off my second answer before you say something that will pigeonhole me even more. That I mean, they're all related though, but second one is going to be just training history. So training age, like, okay, what are they used to doing in the weight room or in sport or whatever else? Maybe like goals aside, but what are they actually used to? What are they familiar with? That's going to be my second consideration.
You can tell a lot that you are in a competitive setting much more than I am. And I'm like a lot more working with general population because my second one is like, what's the time available on a consistent basis to be able to put towards training? Because some people it's like 2 hours a week max. And then other people, it's like, oh, I got 6 hours and I want to do 6 hours. But, those are very different styles of training kind of based on what's right for that person.
Yeah, it's a good point because a lot of what we tailor is, you can check ultimately all the boxes, I think, with any given time frame. It's just the magnitude of how well you check those boxes, but the time consideration per week is, yeah, definitely important. And you're right. I'm fortunate. Like the most of the population I work with, they kind of have to work with me. They're obligated to. It is part of their daily schedule. Not that they don't enjoy it, but I don't really have to worry about that piece because they just come to me when they're supposed to, and we go from there. All right, third one for me in terms of considerations, we would highlight maybe more over just the gender specific considerations. I'll go a little bit more broad here too, and just say more external habits and getting more like lifestyle oriented and maybe just like their recovery habits. So like sleep and nutrition and fueling specifically around recovery, like protein intake, adequate carbs and stuff like that. So that'll be my third kind of more ambiguous answer.
We got there. We got one that's the same. There we go. Because I was thinking lifestyle
Nice.
habits. I mean that has to be a part of it because you can train as much as you want. You can be as committed as you want to just going and getting a workout in. But if the rest of the 23 hours a day are garbage, you're not going to make any progress.
Doesn't matter if you're training like the best female only workout program in the world if you're not doing all the other stuff right. So couldn't
Yeah.
agree more. Well, sorry to throw that curveball at you, but I think we navigated it well.
Yeah, we got through it. I think I need to go and like ask ChatGPT like what's 30 questions Aaron could ask me that I might not be expecting and just see what it gives me. So
ChatGPT's not there yet. I keep asking it to write workouts, like just to see like, okay, how good is ChatGPT getting at writing workouts? And it still doesn't think like me. I still poke holes in some of the programs it spits back out at me. But I will say it is getting better, which isn't good for my job security. But I'll usually try to sabotage it as well. Like I'll ask like, hey, can you write like a workout that includes this and this for me? And then I'll just tell it like, no, I want the volume to be like quadrupled and make it way heavier. And then no, I want it to last for 10 hours long. And then at the end, I'll be like, okay, thank you, ChatGPT. This is perfect. Just so I can make sure that it's like, that's probably the people that actually know how AI works are like, you idiot. But in my mind, that's keeping me safe by telling it wrong things. So I'm going to keep believing that so I can still have a job.
they probably hate people like you that try to sabotage it, but who knows? There's probably some person on a computer back there sitting there like, oh, there's another one of those guys, and they just like delete it from the data that it pulls from or something.
Yeah. Yeah. Another nerd.
Another nerd. All right. Well, if you enjoyed this podcast, thank you so much for listening. Please like it, review it, share it. It means a lot to us if we can reach more people and help ultimately other people improve their health and with reliable and helpful health information. So stay tuned for future episodes.